Good evening. How's everybody?
So far, so good.
Good. Good. Dr. Tobias, how was your day?
It was a good high school day. It was great. Really.
Good. Good. I used to have a few of those, not as many as I would have liked. Most of them were not good days, but that's okay. That's part of the business. That
I
is.
have school, so I have, it's always entertaining.
Yeah, that's true. There's never a dull moment. I can tell you that. There's never a dull moment. All right. And there's Dr. Massengill. He's in a lovely middle school. You know that they never have any drama in middle school.
Absolutely not.
I know myself well enough to know that I would have never made it as a middle school principal in the era of social media.
There are days where I don't think I'm going to make it.
No chance.
You got to embrace it.
That's it.
No chance. Not in the era of social media. I was middle school principal and a junior high principal. One was a 6'8", one was a 7'9", before I became a high school principal. And I can only imagine the he said, she said stuff in that went on then that goes on now through social media. I would lose my grip.
The problem is it never ends. Used to they went home, they had time to cool down. Well, now they just keep going.
That's what I mean. It's a constant. That's what I hear from everybody that works at that level. That it's all day, every day. That stuff you can never eradicate it. That it's just like a constant roll all the time. I don't know how you focus on having school. I really don't. If you're having that all the time. I used to work with a fellow in Charlotte, Mecklenburg. We were high school principals together. Ron Thompson, he was at East Meck. And Ron used to talk all the time about what he called having school. You got to have school. You got to get the faculty and the students focused on having school every day. But that was your biggest task as a principal, was focusing everybody on the goal of academics. That was your deal. And anything that kept you from doing that, you weren't having school. And I can certainly see that would be to try to get them to focus on the task at hand, teachers and students. It'd be mind-numbing. All right. Well, I'll go ahead and get started. It's 7 o'clock. Thanks everybody for joining us tonight. It's Mels 603, spring of 2020. This is week 3. Before I get to our weekly schedule tonight, I want to get to this note that I have put on the course overview: applying for graduation. Be sure to apply for graduation March 18th when you receive an email from the registrar. I didn't have a date Monday night, and I told everybody to go ahead and register, and I knew that would trigger them to either let you register or they'd come up with a date. So they decided to come up with a date. They're kind of slammed with this accelerated deal on people can walk in May. So as I told you Monday night at the town hall, for those of you who were with me, you just got to be, to participate in the ceremony, you have to be graduating. You folks who are out on licensure, we'll try to do something at 3 that afternoon in terms of a reception, but you won't walk in the parade at this point. I'm advocating for you, but that's never happened before. And so I'm not sure it'll happen this time, but we're trying to get to the point where our add-on licensure people and our regular master's people can participate in the actual graduation ceremony. But at this time, we'll do a reception for the School of Ed, and you are welcome to come to that as long as you're caught up in task stream. But you will apply for graduation on March 18th. Yes, everybody, I know it's said, you just said there, we don't get to participate, but everybody has to apply for graduation. Now, it's half price for add-on licensure people, but you do have to apply for graduation. All right, so please remember, you will apply March 18th. That $75 fee covers all of the transcript to DPI for your license. It covers that nice certificate that you get from Jostens with the official seal on it. It covers all the work that Seth does and Stephen Sane to make sure that everything is done. And to DPI, you'll have to fill out one form, but they'll do the bulk of that. And so all that's covered in that cost of $75. So again, I've got it here, and you'll go ahead and do that. Before we get to our weekly schedule, I want to go over, and we've got an OMA help under OMA task and prompts, and I've added a few things. I was asked, what specifically are you looking for in task 1? Well, I'm looking for internal and external. On the external, remember, go to your advanced ed or your SACs, all that median income of your community, average education level, give us a visual snapshot of your community. And then on the internal, I'm looking for things from the state report card, like academic progress, disciplinary data, attendance data, staff qualification, advanced degrees, include any state and national demographic comparisons, then cover your district, state, and federal laws, all of those programs, EC, Title I, do an audit of those, what your school has, and then school structures and rules. If you've got a student handbook, I would attach that as an appendices. But in the body of task 1, I need to see, you can attach the faculty handbook as well. Let me write that in, student handbook. I would put these in the appendices. I would put these in the APP appendices, and the faculty handbook in the appendices. In the body of task 1, I want to see your master schedule, your duty roster, and supervision schedule. Let me remind you, duty roster is where you are during the day. Most of the time, during class time, like cafeteria, hall duty, most of the time that's inside of your faculty handbook. I've included both of them because sometimes it's not, but usually it's in your faculty handbook. Supervision schedules like ball game duty, that's your after school activities. And so sometimes those are included in the faculty handbook. Sometimes they're separate documents. I have all 4 of them there, but I want to see your master schedule, duty roster, and supervision schedule. I want to see them in the body of task 1, and you can attach the whole handbook as an appendices, just like the student handbook. And then on the budgeting process, make sure that you address how much input school personnel and the school improvement team have in designing the yearly local budget for your school. That's your link back in that triangle to, does your budget support your school improvement plan? Obviously, if faculty and school improvement team don't have any input in the budget, it's not going to be as likely that your budget is going to support your school improvement plan initiative. And so those are the things that I am looking for in task 1. Now, let me see who's with us tonight. There's Jeanette. Jeanette turned in her task 1, and it was great. So if you go on discussion board, you can click on Jeanette's work. You can, hopefully people on her team will review it, but you can go in and see it as well. It's just perfect. She's done an outstanding job. She has it all organized. She's done everything. It checks all the boxes. It's as good as I've seen. So you've got a live example and the person in our class who did that. So you can communicate with her. That's in the C8 section. What I'll do for you folks in the C6 section, I'll make sure that you have access to it as well. I'll put it under your template on the OMA. I'll put her work there for you to see it. It is shareable, but she's done an excellent job with that. So I want to make sure that you understand that you can look at hers and see what you need. Now, on task 2, as I told you already, we should be getting near the end of getting task 1 ready and getting to task 2. Task 2 should take you no more than about 30 minutes. That's correct. I said 30 minutes. If it takes you more than that, then you've got a problem, because all you have to do is go back to your AppTel and copy and paste AppTel's task 1 through 3, and then take any labels, directions, or AppTel references off of it, and that is task 2 of the OMA. And so we'll blow right through that one in just minutes, right into task 3. The way this is set up, task 1 by far the longest, most material. Task 2 is a 1 hour deal, and that leads us into task 3, which generally takes about a week, and then task 4, which is writing your competency, shouldn't take you more than a couple of hours. And so don't get scared that, oh my Lord, task 1 takes 2 weeks. How are we going to get? You're going to make up all that time and more on task 2. Task 3 is a normal length, and task 4 is short. We'll have more than enough time to do our 2 evidences this semester, because these are a whole lot less involved than the 2 you did last semester, and you got through that. So please remember that's what we'll be looking for. And so if you're working with your coach, these are the things, and they know these are the things that we're looking for. And I'll replace the one that's in there with this one in both, and I'll also make sure that the folks in C6 have access to Jeanette's really good task 1. And thank you, Jeanette, for doing that. All right, so let's talk about our weekly schedule, where we are with that. We're in week 3. Today is January 29th. Examine a school or school district field trip policy. Assuming you're the supervisor on a local trip, what action would you take after a bus rear ends a car, resulting in minor injuries to several students? We already had a couple people move on to that one. We just did emergency plans last week. To kind of close out emergency plans, the takeaway on them is for them to be effective, they must be updated regularly. They must be communicated well. They can't just be on somebody's desk or on a flash drive somewhere and nobody knows what they are. So they must be updated regularly, communicated effectively, and they must be practiced on a regular basis. Having them updated and having them available, but if you never practice them, you don't find out how things are going to go wrong until you practice them a time or 2. So that's kind of the takeaway on discussion board 1. Now, as we get into discussion board 2 and we talk about negligence and liability, I had an excellent response on that one too. Is the first thing that you would do if you were on that bus and you're the supervisor, first thing you do is call 911. Now, I want you to find your local policy on field trips and these kinds of things, but I'm going to tell you, the overarching theory is the first call you make, first thing you do is you call 911. Any delay in that, you may lose your job and you may be sued. You're not qualified to do triage or make decisions how badly kids are hurt. You need to make sure that you get 911, the emergency services there as quickly as possible. That's a non-negotiable. Don't call the superintendent's office. People would call me and I'd say, have you called the police? No, hang up and call them. I don't want to be seen as part of a cover-up or a delay. Call 911 before you call anybody else, and then you can call the principal or you could call the superintendent's office. Now, there's also a back bounce on that one. Let me catch this question. All right, quick. Can somebody clarify personnel? Do teachers get any input? They're number 5 on the list. Let me go back and catch that question. We're looking for two types of participation in the budgeting process. Number 1, does the school improvement team have any input? And number 2, on how you build a master schedule and how you build a budget is somewhat similar. You're supposed to get teacher input as well. So do teachers have input in your budget? What do you need in your classroom? And does the school improvement team have input to make sure that the budget priorities align with the school improvement plan priorities? Those are the 2 things we're looking for.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, back to the back bounce on discussion board 2. Every district has a policy on dealing with parents that arrive on scene and media that arrive on scene. Don't make the mistake of talking to the media. You have not been cleared to speak for the district. And so if the media arrives on scene and sticks a microphone in your face, you decline politely and refer them to the school district's public information office. Now, they know the rules, but they'll see if you do. Just like you notice when something happens at a school and they're interviewing parents and they're running along beside their cars and sticking a microphone in their face, they know they're not supposed to be on school campus. And so they wait right off campus and flag cars down, pull them over. Teachers, administrators, no one speaks to the press unless it goes through the public information office. That's the rules. Now, parents who arrive on scene to pick up their kids, that should be part of the emergency plan. There's kind of a logical flow to this. That should have been covered in your emergency plan when parents arrive on scene to pick up their kids. And whatever the district's policy is on that is what you should follow. So make sure that you kind of refer back to your emergency plan. Make sure that you find out that every district has a policy on field trips and accidents and those kinds of things. And every district has a policy on who and when can speak to the media. Make sure that you include all those in your answer because all of those are important. Don't think that you're a celebrity because somebody stuck a microphone in your face. They're just trying to get you to speak extemporaneously and get information that they're not allowed to have. So make sure you understand that. We'll cover FERPA later on, Family Education Privacy Act. You can't be giving out kids' personal private information at all. And so anything that gets said to the media has to be vetted through your public information office, and they'll have one of the associate general counsels make sure that it's legal to talk to anything that they do put out to the media on such a thing as that. So that's where we're headed. Next week, we'll kind of wrap up this particular section where we talk about and reflect on the fact that you get found liable, negligent, personally responsible when things go bad if you don't do the right things. And so we'll kind of finish this safety module up next week. So that's where we are right now. We're third week. We're still in our safety zone right now. We'll move out of safety into discipline and due process next. So it's kind of a logical sequence. You got to do the safety security thing. It's just like Maslow's higher order, of needs. You got to have safety and security first. Then we'll talk about having some order and putting some law with it as we go along. Anybody have any questions on next week's discussion board 2? If not, I'll get into the content for the evening, which is our most relevant court cases. You should read about these in your law book. I have picked the ones that are most relevant. There's some more. I won't claim that these are all that are important, but these are the major ones that I'm going to hit upon, starting with the modern era of schooling, which started in 1954 with Brown versus the Board of Education. that said separate was not equal. It led to, some years later, integration. Now, if you said to me, well, Dale, that was 1954, and schools really didn't even start trying to integrate until after the Civil Rights Act of 65. North Carolina didn't even start until 66, and I'd say, I know that because I was in school then, and I remember when it happened. There's few advantages to being old. That's one of them. You're old enough to remember real stuff. I was in school in 1966, and I remember quite vividly integration happening. There wasn't a lot that happened between 1954 and 1965. The Civil Rights Act was passed by the Johnson administration in 65. And so that pretty much said we had to start integrating. And so North Carolina started in 66. And that was followed by school consolidation. We started consolidating schools because we didn't need dual systems anymore, where we had school systems for African American kids and we had school systems for white kids, often schools in the same geographic areas. And so we started consolidating schools. And at that same time in 66, I have my sneaking suspicion why it happened. The state of North Carolina got out of capital funding. And what that means is they would no longer build schools or give districts money to maintain or run school buildings. They got out of that business during that time. There's debate and there's been books written and policy papers as to why that happened. I don't know, but I just know that that's what happened in 1966. That was a major shift in how schools got funded. From that point forward until Leandro, and it's only partial, North Carolina completely and other states got out of capital funding, and then the responsibility to build and maintain school facilities was passed on to the local education agency, or LEA. That would be your county or city school district. There are still 14 city districts left in North Carolina. There's 100 county districts. South Carolina has 55 districts, counties and some of them with multiple districts inside of them. So whatever your LEA is, it's their responsibility to fund schools in terms of the physical plant, build schools, keep and pay the money to keep them up. And that's why schools are in the bond business. They have to let bonds in order to be able to do capital campaigns. The state does not build buildings for you. Now, there's a caveat to that we'll cover later on this semester when we get to our funding court case, when we talk about Leandro. That's how we got the state lottery, but that's not a funding. That is not a funding plan. That's a separate piece. So the states got out of building and keeping buildings up in 1966. Along about that time, very, very importantly, in 1965, we had the Elementary and Secondary Acts of 1965, which instituted Titles 1 through 9. Now, everybody's familiar with Title I. That's to help disadvantaged kids, economically disadvantaged kids in reading and math. Title IX is gender equity. Those were passed in 65. And that also changed the directory and the course of schools. For the session that we'll start in 2 weeks, when we start talking about students' rights and discipline, that was not a thing before 1969. In 1969, at the height of the Vietnam War, there was a court case in Des Moines that got to the Supreme Court, Tinker versus Des Moines. We had war protesters on campuses, and the Supreme Court ruled that some amount of disruption is normal and that students had due process rights. Prior to that time in school, for the most of my formative years in school, we didn't have any rights. They could just jerk you up and do whatever they wanted to. They did with me regularly. Um, I was a bad chap, and so they didn't have to give you a reason why. They just looked like you needed a good beating that day. But after '69, students had full due process rights. The right to give their side of the story, the right to know what the rules are, the right to present witnesses, the right to hear the evidence against them. All the rights that we take for granted today. When I was a young chap in school, we didn't have any of those. It means that they could no longer be arbitrary or capricious. Capricious means that give you more punishment than the actual action called for. They could pretty much beat you to the inch of your life or whatever you did. The punishment didn't have to fit the crime, is my point. Or arbitrarily, Dr. Massengill and I could have been out back smoking, and they could have told him to go back to the room and then taken me and beat the stuffing out of me. That was okay. We have those protections. Students have those protections in the law now, where you can't just treat somebody any way you want to, arbitrarily decide who you want to punish and not punish, or give them whatever punishment that you think deserves the crime, regardless of does it fit the crime or not. So that's a biggie. That kind of sets the tone of the culture of your building in modern schooling as well. Tinker versus Des Moines in '69. The next big thing that came along, which was a national case, happened in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, was the Swan case. Julius Chambers argued the Swan case before the Supreme Court. Which led to forced busing for integration of schools. That stayed in place for 30 years, where districts, if housing patterns were such that schools were not naturally integrated, the district had to use their buses to do that. Charlotte was the test case for busing, and that was upheld by the Supreme Court. That led us to the Education Amendments of '72, where Titles 1 through 9 were reaffirmed again. There was some opposition to those in the court system. They were decided again in '72. And then, kind of after my time in public school, in 1974, Public Law 94-142 was passed, which set aside funding and laws for the education of exceptional children. Prior to that time, exceptional children, if they were at school, they generally just helped the lunchroom staff or the custodial staff. They didn't actually go to class with everybody else. I know that sounds harsh and unbelievable. It's true. I lived that. I saw that. We did not try to educate those children. 95% of them didn't even come to school, and the 5% that did, there was no attempt to educate them until they actually got federal status in 1974. Another case, again, folks made a run at the Elementary and Secondary Acts 1 through 9. They were a final decision and a final victory came in the Robinson case in 1975 that upheld all the titles 1 through 9, which very much are still modern part of modern schooling that we have to deal with every day. In North Carolina, in 1983, the Basic Education Plan was passed, which led us to our first attempt to differentiate salary and job positions. It did not It did not last very long. I was a part of that. It did not last very long because we couldn't or wouldn't afford it. That was our first attempt at differentiated pay or pay for performance. Came as a result of the basic ed plan, which was passed in '83 and implemented in '84. Now, that North Carolina basic ed plan said that every child gets a basic education. And that sounded reasonable to everybody. But then some smart guy in the back held up his hand, or lady, and said, "What is a basic education?" And everybody looked at one another and said, "We have no idea." So we spent the next 6 years developing what was called the North Carolina Standard Course of Study, and other states did as well. And they were big, thick white notebooks. There was one for every grade level, every subject inside those grades. There was one for every high school course. It was the North Carolina Standard Course of Study. And in 1989, when they got through writing all of those and getting them implemented, it took 5.5, 6 years. Everybody said, "All right, we now know what a basic ed program is." And then another smart lady stood up in the back and said, "How do we know that they're getting that?" And somebody said, "What?" They said, "Well, how do we know that they're not doing the same thing with the standard course of study that they did with those reading textbooks? Just took them down to the book room, put them on the shelf, and they're not actually teaching this. How are we going to know that they actually teach this standard course of study so every child gets a basic education?" And then they said, "Oops, we better develop an accountability system." And so in 1989, the first wave of accountability came along, and it was called PBAP, P-B-A-P. I was a principal by then, elementary school. And PBAP stood for Performance-Based Accountability System. And people didn't like that name, and it had little dots between the two little, it was completely confusing. And so that became what we now call the state ABC program. And that's how we got it. That led to the state report card, accountability. This was comparative accountability, but it also led eventually to growth model accountability, and we'll get to that in just, about 10 or 11 years later, we got to that. But it also, the development of the end of grade tests for elementaries and in the course tests for high school courses. That's how we got those. That came in 1989. And that forever changed what school looks like in terms of why we were there every day. But it all started with the basic ed plan that said kids have to get a basic education. We wrote a curriculum to make sure that we knew what that was, and then we started testing to make sure that kids were getting what was being taught was what had been written in those books. And that's developed into that. Now, the next big significant thing that happened, and we're going to have a case this semester, from 1994 to 1998 was the Leandro case. And that's when, because districts were having to put this basic education in and teach all children and make sure that every kid got what was in those big white notebooks, the low wealth districts said, we're not getting as much money to educate kids as the high wealth district. And somebody said, well, you get the same from the state. We'll use around figure about $7,000 per pupil to educate a child. And they said, yeah, but places like Charlotte Mecklenburg are adding another $4 from local tax revenue, and so they're spending about $11,000. We want a system where it's called district power equalizing with a recapture provision. If you want to get technical, it's in your finance book. What we want is the state to give the students of Charlotte Mecklenburg $7,000. Instead of giving them $7,000, give them $5,000. Give us that's extra $2,000. So with our $7,000, so we'll have $9,000. Their local will add $4,000, and they'll have $9,000, and it will level the playing field. So that's what the Leandro lawsuit. Five districts across the state. I think if you were with us last semester, Dr. Stedman, he was actually a principal in one of those low wealth districts at that time that filed that lawsuit. So what they wanted the state to do was to manipulate the state funds, give high wealth districts less money per pupil, and then they could add their local tax revenue to it and take the money that they took from them and give to the low wealth districts. So in the end, you had equitable funding. Well, after 4 years, the genesis or the outcome of the Leandro lawsuit was no, the state the state has no duty to make sure that funding is equitable. The state's duty is to that basic ed, going back to the basic education plan. The basic education plan said the state will fund a basic education. The state determined that it costs $7,000, and so that's what you will get. We will not manipulate that flat funding formula, because the law was the state has to fund a basic education. State determined what that cost, wrote the curriculum, here's the money. They would not. Now, what they said we will do to try to help the low wealth districts, so that's the basic education money. That's $7,000 per pupil that comes to a district. And oh, by the way, it doesn't come all in one lump sum. It comes in 10 installments. And we subtract absences from attendance from that. So that's why it's important. But that $7,000, that is sacred. Now, we know that places like Charlotte are going to add several $1,000s more to that because they have local wealth. But what we're going to do to help the low wealth districts, have I got a deal for you? We're going to create a North Carolina education lottery. And South Carolina did the same thing. And that's where we got the education lotteries, is that the lawsuit to change the state funding per pupil formula lost in court. And so, but the state said, oh, but what we'll do is we'll start a lottery that will generate revenue that we can give to these low wealth districts to help them, especially with capital projects. And so that has happened. The problem with that is it's a regressive tax. Poor people pay it disproportionately because they play the lottery, but also there's not a formula. It's pork barrel. They ran a commercial about 2 days for a county, Surrey, Stokes, somewhere there, where they did the commercial, the good that the lottery does, and they showed on TV, I think it was the superintendent, talking about they built them a new cafeteria with lottery money so all 300 of their students could eat lunch at one time. Now let's get this straight. There wasn't anything wrong with their old cafeteria. They couldn't figure out how to do 2 lunch shifts in their master schedule, I guess. Pinheads. I should have said that, but the kickback on that was so great they pulled that commercial almost immediately. But I use that to illustrate the example that there was no need to build another cafeteria. So there's been limited, not nearly as much money as folks thought. By the time you pay the winners, the lottery company, of advertising and all those things, very few of the lottery dollars ever get back to schools. There's also a scholarship program in that and some other things. And so very few dollars, but even then, the efficacy of those dollars and how they're spent is basically just pork barrel. Why is it central to your organization that all 300 kids in a small high school eat lunch at one time? I mean, they can eat in 2 shifts, 150. I was high school principal. We had 3,000. We had 4 lunch shifts. I didn't consider that to be a disadvantage or create problems for our kids because everybody didn't eat at one time. But so the point is a lot of the revenue generated by the lottery doesn't go to schools, and what does has been of debatable value. But in the end, the Leandro said you cannot manipulate the state per pupil money. It's going to be flat. If it goes to that student, it goes to that student. You can't manipulate it at the local level either, and that's what that's what the brief said at the end. No way, no how, and the districts couldn't do that either. So what that means is if the state gives Granville County $7,000, and Granville says, well, we'll just manipulate it on our own as a district, Leandro said, no, you cannot do that. You can't give some schools more of that 7,000 per pupil than others. Can't do that. You know, that if we give this school 7,000 based on how many students are attending every day, then that money's got to go to that school. It can't be manipulated by the local board or the local superintendent. Now, we're going to have a case study coming up, case study 2, where the superintendent has decided that he wants to do that he wants to manipulate the money that goes as a district. Now, you could give them schools some extra money out of the local budget for programs, but he's talking about as a district-wide initiative, manipulating the money, the budget, which would include state funds. So it looks like a good idea on the surface. So I'm kind of giving you a clue as to what your case study ought to say. When I ask you, is he doing the right thing versus the legal thing? You better know that you can't be manipulating state money. That $7,000 per pupil has to go to that school where that pupil is. That's what Leandro said. Now, we could argue that that's not right or fair or any of those kinds of things. I'm just telling you that's what the law is. Now, Leandro has been revisited a number of times. There was a revisit last month to Leandro, but that in terms of how students and schools get some extra money, but it's extra money. That 7,000 still is untouchable. And so that's called your Leandro right, or your basic ed right, that a school or school district cannot give somebody else in the district part of your money as an individual pupil. That is your Leandro right. So that is a national case for school funding. And so that's why it is so important, because now we have so many schools and districts and administrators who want to manipulate that because some kids are more expensive than others, but you got to know that you can't do that. Somebody said, does that include charter schools? Charter schools get an amount of money just like everybody else from the state. Now, what they do with their money, they have less restrictions. But now, we can't say, well, this charter school is tied. Now, all charter schools are tied to an LEA. They technically are under the umbrella of that county or school district that they reside in. What we're talking about is they get their 7,000 per pupil just like any other school in that district. Now, what they do with it at the inside of their school has less restrictions than other schools, but no, they still get their 7,000. They may redirect resources inside the school a little bit differently, but we can't say, well, we're only going to give them 5 and the other district schools in the districts are now going to get 7,200. No, they get theirs just like everybody else gets theirs. They have less restrictions on how to spend it, but they still have some guidelines as how they spend that money. That's a good question. We're going to cover charter schools a little bit later, but that's a good question. Charter schools are still public schools. They still get a per pupil just like every other student, like every other school in that district. They are technically. When students move from charter schools, it's not. That's a myth. The money follows the kids by the month. When I say 7,000 per year comes from the state per pupil, the state doesn't send a check for $7,000. At the end of the month, the first month, you got to have enough operating capital to run the first month. At the end of the first month, you turn in your principal's monthly report, PMR, that has your attendance on it for the district, and say it's 95%. That's your district attendance for that month. They take the number of students who attended and sends you $700 a piece. You get it in 10 monthly installments. So this notion, well, this kid was over here at the charter school and they got all the money for the year when he came back. No, they got money for the month that he was there. When he came back to the public school, if he's on your roll next month, you get money for him at your school. The money comes in monthly installments, not in a lump sum. And it comes after the month is over. It does not come the first day of the month. It comes next month. You have to voucher it from the state. That's the modified accrual accounting system. We'll talk about that later as well. So this notion that all these kids taking all this money from charter, yeah, that comes from the district pot, but we got this kid back from charter school this month, and they already got they got his money for the month he was over there, but they didn't get any. You get paid for him every month after that. So I said it's not $7,000 a year per pupil is not 7,000. It's 710 times minus the absentee rate. Why you think I have you include attendance as one of the things you have to look at your school? You don't get paid unless kids come. You don't get your money. They don't pay for the number enrolled. They pay for the number that attend. And they pay after the month is over, not before. That's the way the state reimburses you. So you have to have enough money in your coffers to run the first month. You voucher the state. They give you money back based on $700 minus the attendance rate per pupil. And that's how that works. So that's a myth that kids that come back from charter, that charter got all the money for the year. They did not. They only got the money for the time that they were there, and you'll get it now that they're with you. When a new school is created, it's not about it's about the pupils. It's not about the building. Again, it goes per pupil. It's based on the pupils attending. When a new school was created and it took 200 from over here and 300 from over there, and those 500 get the money over at that school. The money follows the kids, not the building. The building is immaterial. The money follows the student. It's tied to, it's called per pupil. That's why we quote it. It's 7,000 per pupil. It doesn't come as 7,000. It comes in 10 installments of 700. Money follows students. It follows enrollment, follows attendance. Does not follow buildings. That's true. Dr. Massengill just, how they get their money for the first month? They have to have it in fund balance for the district. Districts are required to keep a certain amount of money in fund balance. They have to fund themselves. The county commissioners they have to have a fund balance to run every school the first month. The state doesn't give you money up front for anything. You have to voucher it. Now, Dr. Massengill pointed out when a kid never enrolls in traditional public school and enrolls directly in a charter, there's a net loss. Yeah, you never get the money. That money goes over there to the charter school, so that's a net loss for your district. But in terms of this notion that if they go over to charter and enroll and stay there for 2 days, that school got all the money for that kid for the whole year, that is not true. Third day of school, he comes to you, he's on your attendance roll, not theirs, and you get the money for him. But yeah, every kid that goes to charter, it's a net loss for the district. That is true. That means your district gets less money, but you also have less students to serve. The money follows the students, not the building or the district itself. The money follows the student. You get money for the students that you have that show up every day. That's how that works. All right. So that's the Leandra. We'll get deeper into that one as we get to that case study and we get to the back half of the course when we get to the finance part. In 2001, exactly 30 years, Swan was revisited. It had to be revisited in Charlotte-Mecklenburg because that was where the original case was. And Swan was overturned exactly 30 years later. And the court found that if schools resegregated, school districts or the state was not obligated to remedy that if they resegregated after 30 years of busing. They said that was long enough. If integration was going to take, It should have taken during that 30 years, and if there, a resegregation occurred, the school district nor the state had any obligation to change or to remedy that. As a central office administrator, I left the principalship in 2000. As a central office administrator in Charlotte Mecklenburg, it took about 15 minutes to resegregate. Just that fast. Just that fast. Old patterns are hard to break. After 30 years of integrated schools, literally overnight, they resegregated. We were, even those of us who knew that it was going to happen in the central office, were amazed at the speed at which it happened. Amazed. We could not believe how fast schools resegregated overnight. Didn't matter about magnet programs. It didn't matter about, school of this or school of that. It did not matter. It just immediately, that quick, resegregated. There's a lot of social commentary there that I'll leave up to you, but suffice it to say that if schools are segregated now, the district nor the state has any obligation to remedy that. And so you ask, why is it that we have this low wealth school over here and this rich school over here? It looks like somebody would do something about that. Nope, they don't, not required. Don't have to. That's why in the last 19 years, you've seen a complete change in what schools look like in North and South Carolina. No more integration, not required. If segregation happens, and even if there's people in the district or in the county commission or the city council that put their thumb on it, or in the state legislature, that's the way it goes. There's no duty to fix that. And so we have seen much of that happen. That's institutionalized. And that's why you have these disparities. That's why you get into this court case about, we have this group over here that needs more money than this one because this is no, can't do that. But the reason why people think, there is a need to do that is because we got rid of integration with the Capuchon lawsuit. I was watching Wayne Cernak. I don't agree with a lot of his language, but I was watching his show. It's on HBO, and he did a full documentary special with the Swan Capuchon lawsuit, bracketing, and then what has happened since. And he went to Charlotte Mecklenburg and to look and see. I mean, this was the national case. It's that big that HBO has a special on how schools have resegregated, with Charlotte Mecklenburg as the poster child, using Swan and Capuchon as the 30 years that we attempted and forced schools to integrate, and then how fast they resegregated within a year. They were back to where they were before. And so that certainly has shaped not only the composition of our schools, but the funding. That's what we're talking about, that of what's going on, but we can't change the funding model either. We might acknowledge that schools are higher need than others with poverty children that live in poverty, but we can't be manipulating that money. We've got to find extra money to try to address those. The next big thing on the horizon that you're all aware of, I'm quite sure, is No Child Left Behind. It had two parts to it that most of our candidates don't understand. There is the low performing part, which is about academics. There's another whole side to that, which is persistently dangerous. And we're going to get into that as well. And so in the end, a child is not required or forced to attend either a low performing school or a dangerous school. And there are metrics for each of those. We're going to speak most lengthy about the persistently dangerous part of that. the incidents that occur in your campus that lead to that. We're going to talk about those. It also eventually, thankfully, has gotten us further down the road from comparative accountability, where you compare one group against the other, apples and oranges, to growth model accountability, where we're looking to grow each child individually. It also speaks, No Child Left Behind speaks to teacher retention. And I bet you didn't know how we got the teacher working condition survey in North Carolina and the advanced ed survey in South Carolina, where they ask you all those questions every year or every other year. That is each state's individual required, let me say this correctly without being too pejorative here. It's your required effort at teacher retention. Every state has to have an effort in place to retain teachers, because you can't have highly qualified teachers teaching in their certification areas if you can't keep them. And so every state had to put a retention effort in. North and South Carolina's retention effort are, North Carolina is teacher working condition survey that we pull a lot of data out of in this program. South Carolina is the advanced ed survey. It looks at facilities, resources, time, teacher leadership, school leadership, professional development, management of student conduct, community involvement, all those kinds of things. That's where those came from, is No Child Left Behind. Now, I won't argue that has made or changed the culture of the climate of schools. I hope that it has. But what I will tell you is that will become part of your principal evaluation, is those scores on those two surveys. That will become part of your evaluation. So you better know what's on them, and you better be working as we do. When we get to the cap for you next semester, one of your evidences is going to be to try to move 5 of those areas: time, resources, facilities, teacher leadership, and school leadership. Those are the 5 designated by the State Board of Education that we have to have you try to move in a cultural advocacy plan. But it's also the smart thing to do, because that's one of the ways that you're going to be evaluated, is on those scores that come from TWC, survey scores and advanced ed. So you can't ignore them. And so we're going to spend one of our 6 evidences on teaching you, hopefully, how you can improve those scores and work to make lives better for the people who work in your building. Yes, that is part of it. We're also, second half of this semester, when we get to the skip, we're going to use some of that data from the teacher working condition survey and advanced ed on school leadership. We're going to pull some of that data this semester. But that's where those came from. The states didn't just decide all of a sudden on their own. We care about teachers now, and we care about their lives and what they have to live with every day. No, they do it because the federal government says they're required to do it. Now, we can take it in that spirit, or we can look at it as a way to actually improve the lives of the people on our campus. And I hope that that's the way, in the spirit that it's intended, that you will take it that way. 2010, we formalized our notion that comparative accountability was not the way to go, that we were comparing apples and oranges. How do we compare kids from this economic background to that one? And so we got into the growth model business, where we're looking to grow each kid individually. It's called value added, EVOS. When we get to that point, Dr. Massengill is going to share his portal, his principal portal, where that factors heavily into scheduling. Who teaches what, where, and why? We're actually going to move into that here pretty quickly, and he's going to talk to us about that. The initial was, their goal was to get to where 50% of a teacher's evaluation would be based on their EVOS score and 50% on principal rating. We're not there. I don't know that we need to be there, but that was the stated goal at the beginning. We revisited paper performance again in 2010. It came back up after a nearly 20-year hiatus. Well, actually longer than 20-year, about 25-year hiatus. It tried to come back. The lottery was going to fund some of that. Pre-K scholarships, low wealth, paper performance, but there wasn't enough money to do pre-K scholarships and low wealth out of that, and so the paper performance piece went by the wayside again. They way overestimated how much money would be left over in the lottery. But we did attempt again in 2010 to differentiate pay between teachers. Obviously, that has not happened. There just wasn't enough money. We had a good system the first time. I was principal in a career development pilot the first time around, but there just wasn't enough money. And then kind of in 13-14, which has set the last kind of segment of modern public schooling, is vouchers, charter school expansion. Other than just being an anomaly, they became a thing. Elimination of master's pay for teachers, and elimination of career status, a continuing contract. Now, these are the things that have shaped what public education looks like today. I could argue that there's 15 more that I could have put on the list. I couldn't cover them in 1 hour, though. Remember, we have to do this in segments. But I think a lot of things work off of these, and we're going to get more deeply into these as the semester goes along. But if you understand these, you have context for all of our case studies. You have context for every module we do. If you know this is why we do it, you'll have context when we talk about a master schedule about making sure that it works. That when we get to number 4, best practices EVOS, you'll understand, that's why that goes there. We go federal law first on a master schedule. We're going to talk about this next week as we get to task 3. When you're designing a master schedule process, federal law, state law, local board policy, EVOS, and then teacher input. We'll talk about that in our scheduling process that I'm going to talk to you about next week. Let me Brenda asked, net loss of the district, was it because of district lines? No, it's because, again, it's not about lines or buildings or any of that. Money follows students. If they're not with you in your district and they're in a charter school, the money comes from the state and goes to them. Money follows students from the state. It doesn't go to a building. And then Dr. Massengill kind of rounded out is that the teacher working condition survey is an entire goal of principal professional goals as required by the superintendent of his district. Wow. So it's real. TWC in advanced ed, it has tremendous implication for your evaluation as a school principal. EVOS also has tremendous implications on how well you use it and how well you use use it in building your master schedule. These are big concepts. These are the big rocks of our business. All right. Anybody, hopefully, another week or two, we're going to get where you get to talk when you do your presentation on case studies, and I get to talk less and y'all get to talk more. But we've got to set the context of where we are and where we're going this semester. We got to have the big ideas and know what the big rocks are. And then it gets a little bit better as we go. So I appreciate you hanging in there with me. Dr. Massengill, you got anything to kind of add to tonight?
Important stuff. I think the charter school piece is becoming a bigger and bigger deal. I mentioned what I did about the net loss to students not enrolling in the district and enrolling directly in charter school, because a lot of local budgets don't include any type of supplemental funding to the school boards related to that net loss. So in my district, Moore County, only 22 schools this year we had an $800,000 loss due to charter school enrollments because they've invaded.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's becoming a really, really big deal. And so the role of the principal is changing to where you're not only an instructional leader, you're also sort of like a headmaster. You got to be out there in the community telling people what you're doing, marketing your school and your district, because you're in a position where it's more of a business model. You're competing for students. So the role of the principal is in some places very quickly and in some places gradually changing to something to be a little bit more comprehensive than what it is, which I didn't think that was possible 4 years ago, but it is.
It is. So if any of you students who have read ahead on the skip that we're doing the second half, in task 3 of the skip, that's what we're going to do, is develop a marketing plan for your school because we have to. If you don't, you can't stay in business. That's going to become a big part of what you have to do is that marketing plan, as Dr. Massagill said. Dr. Tobias she's in Durham. She's at a what I call a special school, and the whole purpose of that special school, that's probably a better name than that, is market share, is to be more responsive to the needs of the students in the community. As little as 20 years ago, we would have never dreamed of doing something like that. Every school is the same. But in order to get and maintain market share, we do things like that. So, Dr. Tobias, I'm going to let you close us out tonight.
Yeah, for me, my job is I'm very political. I have to constantly be out in the public, although the school sells itself, but that's exactly what I have to do. It's not the traditional principal role. I have to be somebody that's in the public eye all the time, and my students, because we have to sell the school.
Mm-hmm. Hers is a choice school, and students have to choose to go there. Am I correct in that no students are actually district to your school?
No, it's a blind lottery, but we have no home district.
Right.
You apply and the lottery's blind, but there are no home district.
Mm-hmm.
Happen to be at a great school that we don't have a huge like people want to come. So right now it's lottery season, so I have a waiting list of 200 people to get in, and only 100 will get in.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I always still have to market because of the district that we're in.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's going to be the nature of the business going forward as we have more and more competition from outside forces. That's going to be the nature of the job. Now, some of you work in those, and we welcome you. And we're just interested in kids getting educated. But this is the life of school administrators. Charter schools have to market themselves as well. They have to get people to choose to come to them. So the days of schools and prisons being alike, you didn't get to choose them and they didn't get to choose you, those days are over. You're going to have to get into the political realm. And we're going to help you with that the second half of the semester in your skip. We're going to teach you and we're going to put together how to build a marketing plan for your school. All right. Anybody have anything else for the good of the group before we go tonight? Again, I'm always excited when people show up. I thank you for all coming tonight. I will go back, as I said, and make sure that I have put my updated, that little template that Dr. Robertson, it'll be under OMA task and prompts, kind of a quick reference guide or a cheat sheet. And I'll also make sure that those of you in C6 can see Jeanette's task 1, because it is the example. I'll see you next week. Thank you.